Good evening. This will be a tropical weather update for September 11th, 2020. Please note I'm not a meteorologist, and all the thoughts and opinions I give here are mine alone. Always consult the National Hurricane Center for the latest up-to-date information on Paulette, Tropical Depression 19, and all other storms this year. So tonight I'd like to focus mainly on Tropical Storm Paulette and Tropical Depression 19 since they are the greatest threats to land at this point. So Paulette today has had a pretty eventful day. It's managed to develop upshear convection from its bursts pretty much the entire day, and that's of course a good sign for a storm that's been dealing with 30 to 40 knots of shear. Certainly a healthy structure overall for a storm under those kinds of conditions. You'll notice though, of course, you can still see a little bit of the lower level circulation exposed here, but generally speaking, conditions are expected to improve over the next 24 hours pretty heavily, and that will allow for Paulette to strengthen. Currently, Paulette's expected to become a hurricane, rather powerful hurricane with winds over 100 miles per hour. And the area that's at risk from this storm is Bermuda. So while the East Coast will dodge a bullet here due to steerings, Bermuda it won't get so lucky it seems. So they're going to be at a very high risk of a hurricane now. It could pass to the west of them, could pass to the east of them, could be a direct hit. Hopefully Bermuda avoids a direct hit. But if we look at some modeling here, the GFS model currently takes Paulette as a powerful hurricane just to the west of the island, and the HWRF does the same thing, tracking Paulette just to the west of Bermuda, although this is almost a direct hit with Bermuda in the eye wall. So this is, of course, a little bit concerning because Paulette could go just a tiny shift with how tiny Bermuda is. A small shift in the forecast track can make all the difference between Bermuda getting hit pretty hard or possibly getting spared from the worst impacts. So it's going to be something to watch. Exactly how strong Paulette becomes and exactly where Paulette tracks is going to be very important to watch. If you're in Bermuda, you definitely want to be following all the latest updates from the National Hurricane Center. This looks to be like it could be a very significant system if the worst case scenario happens, which I guess would be a direct landfall. So if you live in Bermuda, definitely want to be paying attention. And I'd also like to now look at Tropical Depression 19. So Tropical Depression 19 developed just a few hours ago, designated at 5 p.m. today. So last night we began to see signs of greater organization from what was then Invest 96L when it began to develop thunderstorms like this in a more concentrated manner east of here now. And now it's over here. So what happened tonight was we saw concentrated convective activity, which allowed for an LLC to develop throughout the day, and now we have a tropical depression. So the biggest issue for the storm now, which I'll show you on radar, is that the lower level circulation is located more to the north. You'll notice very little convective activity here, not really so much going on. But to the south, you'll notice the MLC here. You can see it spinning just in the radar here. And it's been taking, what's interesting here, is it's been taking a little nosedive to the southwest. So it has most of the activity going with it, which you can also see on IR. You see there's a little bit of a burst here, but most of it's been located down here. So that's interesting because, you have to wonder, could the center reform further to the south and then avoid a landfall in Florida? If that was the case, it would be better for Florida because they avoid the direct impacts tonight, which could potentially be some heavy rain, gusty winds, possibly some tornadoes if some cells spin up, which would be great for them. But when it comes down the line to the rest of the forecast track, which we'll show now, the Gulf Coast, possibly, really anywhere should be watching now, from Texas to the Florida Panhandle. That would be worse for them because, of course, if the storm manages to avoid land interaction and it ends up going further to the south, it could get its act together faster, more time over warm water, because it's important to mention the waters in the Gulf of Mexico are very warm. So you have very warm water, overall very low shear. So it's a very good environment for Tropical Depression 19. It certainly could get its act together pretty fast tonight if it manages to stack its centers. That's really the biggest issue for it right now, I'd say. When a storm doesn't have a completely stacked MLC and LLC, it can, of course, it makes strengthening usually hold off for a little bit. So we're definitely going to have to watch to see if the LLC manages to regain convective activity and just kind of pull the MLC up, and storm goes on and makes a landfall maybe near Miami, or the storm manages to redevelop a center further south near the MLC, and with this southwest jog it ends up going west eventually, and possibly maybe hits the Keys, but you end up avoiding most of the worst impacts in Florida, but it ends up being able to get its act together more for the future. Now, of course, as it stands right now, TD19 is expected to peak as a 70-mile-per-hour storm, but even the National Hurricane Center mentions that could be a little bit of a conservative number because the storm could get its act together faster, as I mentioned, and especially if the center reforms further to the south, that would certainly allow it to get its act together faster. Especially because tonight, of course, during the journal maximum cycle overnight, that would be a great time for the storm to try to stack its centers, especially if it manages to form a new LSC further south. That would be, a great time for the storm to try to strengthen more. And that's how you could possibly get a tropical storm landfalling in Florida before that happens. So the current case now is that you cannot rule out a Cat 1 hurricane or a hurricane in general. Certainly could be the worst case scenario. And of course, if you get a further south track, even places up into Texas should be watching. If you're along the Gulf Coast at this point, I definitely say you want to keep a close eye on this storm. Certainly can't ignore it. It developed rather quickly, and it will probably get its act going pretty quickly. Strengthening should be steady once it manages to develop a better defined core, especially now. They were actually, the MLC and LLC were actually closer to each other earlier this evening, but the southwest dip has, of course, caused the MLC to end up further away from it. And considering the fact that right now you'll notice it really does have most of the convective activity, you have to think it might be able to reform the LLC. But at the same time, there has been a burst here closer to the LLC. So we'll have to watch how this evolves tonight. Exactly where the center ends up being is going to be pretty important for the future of this storm. Exactly how strong it gets, exactly how organized it is by the time it reaches into the Gulf, of course, is going to be important to watch. The Gulf Coast, of course, right now is at risk, but Florida is still getting the impacts tonight. As I mentioned, you could get heavy rains, flash flooding, river flooding, things like that. You're going to have to, and of course, possibly tropical storm force conditions if it strengthens into a tropical storm before landfall tonight. That's, of course, all going to be concerns with Florida. But the greater risk from this storm is down the line as it enters into the Gulf and will impact somebody along the Gulf Coast. A little bit hard now to say exactly who, but the track will hopefully be further resolved once the storm develops a more defined LLC, or rather it stacks its LLC and MLC. And then you could get a better idea at exactly who's going to be impacted. But for now, if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast, you should definitely be keeping an eye on the storm. Be prepared for a possible hurricane landfall next week. That's probably the worst case scenario as of now. Of course, always hope for the best, but always be prepared for the worst. So I guess I'll close out with this. If you live in Bermuda, be prepared. I don't think you could rule out the possibility that Paulette becomes briefly a major hurricane. We hope that happens, after Bermuda. But you have to be careful with these kinds of things. Paulette's structure has been pretty impressive, so it's possible Paulette could undergo rapid intensification. But we're just going to have to see how that plays out now. I believe there's recon scheduled for both Paulette and TD19 tomorrow, so we should be getting a pretty healthy flow of information to help us learn more about the storm tomorrow and in the future. So, whether you live in Florida, the Gulf Coast, or Bermuda, be prepared for these storms. They're both coming. We're in the peak of the season now, really just passed. Yesterday was the peak. We're expecting a lot of activity. We have 6 disturbances in total now to watch in the Atlantic, so, be prepared. This is the peak of hurricane season. And really, if you haven't already, please have a hurricane plan in place. It's always better to be prepared than not be prepared. So thank you. I hope you stay safe if you're in the path of these storms, and we'll be providing more updates for you on these systems. Good night.